They called him a cripple, a drifter, a useless old soldier sweeping stalls for a roof over his head. No one listened when he spoke until the morning he stepped forward in front of the ranch, hands the vet and the proud landowner, and said 7 words that silenced them all. "I know how to save your horse." What followed defied logic, defied pride, and would turn a broken veteran and a dying champion into a story the whole town would never forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun had barely risen above the flat horizon of northern Texas, yet the air already carried the weight of a sweltering day. Heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and the dust rising from every hoof step and bootfall, until it clung to skin, to hair, to breath itself. Whitmore's stables stretched wide across the parched land, once a place of pride, now showing its years with sagging fences and weather-worn barns. The stables themselves carried a constant haze of smells, sweet hay gone brittle, sharp ammonia from urine that never quite rinsed out the sour heaviness of manure baking under the sun. Horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, some stamping, some snorting, a few tossing their heads as the flies returned for another long summer's torment. Over the din came the bark of orders. Earl Thompson, the capataz, had a voice like a whip crack. He cursed at the younger hands, ordered them to work faster, louder, rougher. Buckets' clattered hooves struck against wood ropes, strained. The ranch was alive, but not with calm rhythm, more like the thrum of tension. The relentless hum of a machine kept running on intimidation. Within this swirl of dust and noise, one figure moved slowly, half hidden, almost swallowed by the chaos. Jack Callahan. To most, he was little more than a background shadow, an aging man with a limp bent beneath the weight of a muck fork or staggering under the load of hay bales. He carried himself with a smallness that seemed deliberate, as though shrinking from notice. But there he was, in the middle of Whitmore stables, pushing a wheelbarrow that squeaked with every turn of its crooked wheel. Dust clung to his sweat-damp shirt, and the sun caught on the metal tip of the cane he leaned on when the ground felt unsteady beneath him. To the others, he looked like an afterthought in a place built on horses and pride. Yet, in the still moments, those rare seconds when the noise dropped low, there was something in his eyes that set him apart, something the rest were too busy to notice. Jack was past 50, though his face suggested more. The skin was toughened by sun, and wind deeply creased around the eyes and mouth. Each line told a story, though none of them had ever been spoken here. He wore his years the way a soldier wears his gear, unavoidable, heavy, but borne without complaint. His limp was the most visible marker, a permanent reminder left by a piece of shrapnel in a war most people preferred to forget. The cane he used was nothing more than an old hickory stick with a rubber tip taped to the bottom. But it had become as constant a companion as his own shadow. His eyes were perhaps the most striking gray-blue, sometimes dull with fatigue. But at the faintest provocation, they flashed with the sharp awareness of a man who had once lived in places where every movement meant survival. More than once, a young hand had caught that glimmer, looked away quickly, sensing something dangerous, something earned far from the quiet fields of Texas. Jack bore the scars, openly a jagged line running down his left forearm, another across his collarbone. They weren't the kinds of scars that came from ranch work. These were battlefield gifts, and though no one asked, their presence whispered of deserts half a world away. Years ago in Iraq and Afghanistan, he had been Sergeant Callahan, decorated for courage, trusted with lives. There had been medals once, and ceremonies, and comrades who clapped his shoulder with respect. But when the service ended, there was no parade for him, no soft landing. He returned to a hometown that no longer remembered his name, carrying only his wounds, and a silence he had no words to break. With no family left and no trade to lean on, He drifted, taking work where he could, until he ended up at Whitmore Stables, a place that valued strong backs more than proud histories. Here he was not Sergeant Callahan. He was just Jack. And to most of them, even that was too generous. The work he was given was always the lowest, the kind no one else wanted. He shoveled manure until the stink lived in his clothes, no matter how many times he scrubbed them. He dragged bales of hay across uneven ground, the dust coating his arms and sticking to the sweat on his neck. He filled buckets and hauled them water sloshing out and darkening the dirt trails in brief cooling lines that evaporated within minutes. His wages were barely enough to call a living, and his shelter was a shack out behind the last row of stalls, an old bunkhouse left to rot. The roof leaked when it rained, the iron bed squealed under his weight, and in winter, the wind whistled through the cracks so that his blanket was never enough. Still he stayed, because it was a roof, because he had known worse. Among the other ranch hands, his presence was treated like a joke. They tossed words at him the way they tossed pebbles at tin cans. The crippled soldiers slower than the horses. He's just here 'cause Whitmore won't waste money on real help. The laughter was sharper than any insult alone, because it carried the ring of agreement, the comfort of a shared cruelty. Jack rarely responded. He'd pause, adjust the grip on his cane, and return to work with a silence that unsettled no one but himself. He had learned long ago that answering mockery gave it fuel. Better to let it burn out in their own boredom. Better to stay invisible. Yet, invisibility carried its own price. In the evenings when the work was done and the ranch settled into the hum of cicadas and distant cattle lowing, Jack would retreat to his shack. There, beneath the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, he'd sit at a rickety table and eat whatever was left. Cold cornbread beans gone stiff. He chewed slowly, not out of enjoyment, but out of habit, staring into the small flame like a man watching ghosts. Sometimes he would catch himself whispering names, brothers in arms who hadn't made it home. The silence after each name pressed heavier than the heat of the day. He didn't complain. Complaints changed nothing. But his eyes told the truth, eyes that had seen too much, that carried whole deserts and battlefields within them. They were eyes of a man alive in body, but wandering without a map, a man who had survived everything except purpose. The only person who broke that silence was Martha Jenkins, the ranch cook. She was a stout woman with quick hands and quicker opinions, who kept the kitchen running like a military unit of her own. Now and then, when food was left over, she would appear at the shack's door with a plate of biscuits or a slice of pie wrapped in cloth. "Don't let it go to waste," she'd mutter, pretending she hadn't sought him out. Jack would thank her quietly, and for a few minutes, the loneliness lifted. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a reminder that he hadn't vanished entirely. Above him, all the ranch revolved around one man, Charles Whitmore. At 62, Whitmore stood like a monument to himself, tall, broad, his belly padded by prosperity, but hidden beneath tailored vests and pressed shirts. His boots gleamed, his Stetson was always spotless. And when he walked, the stable's men stepped aside as if some minor royalty had passed. Whitmore's pride was his empire of horses, animals that had once carried his name into racing headlines. Photographs still lined the office walls, stallions draped in roses, jockeys hoisting trophies, Charles in the center, smiling like a king. The years had dulled the stables, but not his arrogance. To the town, he remained a figure of wealth and dominance. The man whose ranch paid wages and whose opinions steered gossip. To Jack Callahan, he was the face of disdain. Whitmore tolerated Jack's presence not out of kindness, but calculation. A crippled old soldier would accept less pay, complain less, and break his back to keep a place to sleep. cheaper than hiring real help, Whitmore once said, within earshot, not caring if Jack heard. One afternoon, when Jack stumbled carrying a bucket of water and spilled half across the dirt, Whitmore's voice cut sharper than any whip. "You're lucky I let you stay here at all. Don't mistake pity for respect." The words hung heavy, witnessed by the younger hands who smirked at their boss's cruelty. Jack didn't argue. He only nodded once, set the bucket upright, and limped away. Inside, the words landed like blows, but he carried them in silence, the way he carried every burden these past years. Whitmore turned on his heel, satisfied, his boots clicking on the boards, as if to hammer in the reminder in this place: Charles Whitmore was king. And Jack Callahan, once Sergeant Callahan, once a soldier decorated and saluted, was nothing more than a shadow in his kingdom. The legend of Whitmore Stables had once been written in silver. His name was Silver Dust, a stallion whose coat shimmered like liquid light, a creature that seemed born not of earth, but of speed itself. Even standing still, he had commanded attention, tall, powerful in the shoulders and haunches, the line of his neck arched like a bow drawn tight. When he ran, it was as though the ground yielded willingly beneath him. Hooves barely touched the dirt before springing off again, mane and tail streaming behind him in a pale river that caught the Texas sun. The newspapers had called him the Silver Lightning. Children painted his likeness in school projects, and Charles Whitmore, his master, wore his victories like a crown. There had been one race that sealed his fame forever, the Kentucky Derby. Silver Dust had exploded from the gate like a shot fired each stride, devouring the track until no competitor could catch him. Under the late afternoon light, when he crossed first and roses draped across his shoulders, the world seemed to gleam along with him. That day, Whitmore had stood at the winner's circle, chest swelling with pride, hand resting possessively on the stallion's reins. To him, Silver Dust was not just a horse. He was proof of Charles's vision, his wealth, his dominion. The office at the ranch still held the photograph. Framed in walnut, it showed Silver Dust's mid-leap muscles alive with power jockey crouched low, the crowd a blur of faces. But dust had gathered on the frame now, and the glass bore a fine scratch across the horse's eye. Time had dulled the shine, leaving only memory and a hollow echo of triumph. That echo ended on an afternoon no one forgot. It was only meant to be a training run, nothing more. The track was clear, the jockey urging him forward with the confidence born of years of dominance. But speed is merciless, and fate needs only a moment. Silver Dust's front hoof clipped the edge of a wooden rail the world pitched, and a heartbeat later, the stallion thundered down in a spray of dirt and splintered timber. The silence afterward was heavier than the crash itself. The jockey rolled away groaning, but the eyes of everyone nearby rested on the stallion, who lay twisted on the ground. His chest heaved, his nostrils flared white with panic, and his front leg bent at a wrong angle, bone pressing cruelly against skin. When he tried to rise, he collapsed again, the scream that tore from him, half shriek, half roar, the sound of pains no one wished to hear. By the time they dragged him back to the stables, Silver Dust was no longer the shining thunderbolt of Whitmore's pride. He lay in the dark corner of a stall, the straw beneath him damp with sweat and urine, his sides heaving in shallow, ragged breaths. His eyes rolled with confusion and terror, wide and white, a mirror of an animal that knew something had been stolen forever. The stable hands muttered as they passed, "That horse is done. Better sell him for dog meat than waste hay." No one said it kindly. Their tones were matter-of-fact practical. To them, horses were measured by use. A stallion that could not run was no more valuable than a wagon with a broken wheel. And so the gazes that once glittered with admiration now slid past him with indifference, or worse, with disdain. He was not a champion. He was a liability. His stall reflected his new place in the order of things. It was set off in the far corner, away from the thoroughbreds, still kept polished and sleek. The roof above sagged beams, spotted with mold where rain had seeped through. The straw clumped together in damp patches, sharp with the smell of rot. A water trough leaked steadily, dripping in an endless rhythm that stained the floor dark and cold. The flies came first, buzzing mercilessly around his wounds, then the silence of neglect, broken only by the occasional shuffle of his hooves against the boards, when pain forced a twitch. There was no longer polish on his coat, no garlands of roses, no roaring crowd. Only a trembling body lying in shadow eyes, staring blankly toward the doorway. To look at him then was to see not a thoroughbred, but a fallen soldier left behind in the mud, waiting for someone to notice he was still alive. When Dr. Henry Collins arrived, the mood hardened into certainty. He was a man of middle age, neat in his pressed shirt beneath the white coat he wore like armor. A stethoscope hung around his neck, a leather satchel at his side. His hands were competent, practiced, but his eyes were tired, like someone who had long since stopped expecting miracles. He crouched beside Silver Dust, feeling along the leg, listening to the shallow thrum of his breathing. After a long silence, he straightened and pulled off his gloves. "It's over," he said simply. His voice carried the finality of a gavel strike. "The fracture's too severe. He won't race again. Truth be told, he'll never walk properly. Keeping him alive like this is cruel." He glanced toward Charles Whitmore, waiting for acknowledgement, then added in a lower, more practical tone, "The best course is to sedate him, end it quickly. It spares the animal suffering and saves you the expense." A few of the foremen nodded. To them it was obvious. One horse down another could be bought. Life moved on. There were murmurs of agreement, the cluck of tongues, the shifting of boots. No one raised objection. Charles Whitmore did not hesitate. He had been standing just outside the stall arms, folded his fine vest untouched by the dust around him. When Collins gave his assessment, Charles nodded once brisk, as if closing a business deal. "Do it," he said. His voice was dry, stripped of emotion. "Tomorrow this carcass is gone." The word carcass landed like a stone in the room. Not horse, not champion, not partner of glory. Carcass, a thing to be disposed of. The workers lowered their eyes. No one dared soften the decree. No one dared remind him of the victories or the pride. If Charles called him broken, then broken he was. The men filed out, the sound of their boots echoing down the corridor, until silence swallowed the stall again. All except one man remained. Jack Callahan stood in the shadows at the far end, his broom still leaning against the wall. He had not moved, had barely breathed during the exchange. But when Whitmore's words fell, something in him jolted awake. His eyes fixed on the stallion lying in the straw chest, rising and falling like a bellows on its last breath. His hands clenched tight enough for the knuckles to whiten. In that instant, the stable around him dissolved. The smell of hay shifted to the choking stench of smoke and blood. The flies became the whine of bullets. The flickering lantern above transformed into the dying sun over a desert battlefield. Jack saw not a horse, but a friend, a brother in arms, fallen and gasping, left behind in the dirt, while orders commanded the unit to move on. He heard again the promise etched into every soldier's mind. No one left behind. He remembered carrying men heavier than himself across burning sand, remembered holding pressure against wounds while medics scrambled, remembered faces pale and lips whispering for mothers they would never see again. And he remembered the others, the ones they could not carry, the ones abandoned in haste or policy. Those were the faces that haunted his nights. Now, as he looked at Silver Dust, he saw all of them staring back. The stallion shifted, a tremor running through his broken body, and a sound escaped him, a low, painful groan. It was not human yet. Jack felt it like a hand gripping his chest. He stepped forward a half pace, then stopped, forcing himself to stillness. His throat worked, but no words came. Not yet. He was only the crippled soldier here, the shadow sweeping stalls. No one cared what he thought. But deep inside, where memories still burned, something stirred. It was not resignation this time. It was not silence. It was the faint, flickering ember of defiance, the instinct that had once kept him and others alive. He stared at the broken horse lying abandoned in the corner, and for the first time in years, the emptiness in his gaze filled with something else. Resolve. The morning broke heavy and hot, a veil of Texas dust hanging low across the pastures. The sun had not yet burned its way to full strength, yet already the air carried a weight that pressed down on the skin, thick with the scent of hay and manure. By the stables, a gathering had formed, ranch hands, with sleeves rolled up, caps, pulled low boots coated in dirt. They were not there out of grief or ceremony, but because orders had been given. Inside the shadowed stall, Silver Dust lay still, flanks rising and falling in shallow rhythm, his once magnificent head turned toward the wall, as though already giving up the world. A pail of water sat untouched at his side. The flies buzzed in lazy circles above his body, unbothered by the men watching. Dr. Henry Collins stood near the stall door, his leather satchel open, the metallic glint of needles laid out neatly on a cloth. He moved with the calm assurance of a man who had performed this procedure many times before. For him, it was a simple duty, necessary, quick, final. His hand tested the syringe, drawing up the clear liquid that would end the stallion's pain. Around him, the men shuffled, leaning against rails, talking in low tones. Their words carried neither sorrow nor reverence. To them, this was just another task in the life of a ranch, broken tools discarded, broken animals put down. It was part of the rhythm, as ordinary as mending fences or mucking stalls. Then Charles Whitmore appeared. He cut through the crowd without a glance, left or right, the morning light glinting on the polished buckle of his belt, his boots untouched by the dust that clung to every other man. His posture was upright, his expression one of brisk impatience, as though this entire affair was an inconvenience standing between him and his day. "Let's get this over with," he said, voice clipped, eyes cold on the stallion. The words dropped heavy into the silence, an unspoken command that everything should proceed. A few of the ranch hands straightened, nodding quickly, eager to be seen, obeying. And yet from the back of the crowd, another gaze lingered, steady, unblinking, fixed on the broken animal. Jack Callahan stood there, half hidden by taller men, his cane planted firm in the dirt. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his ragged shirt. But his eyes were alive, burning with something none of the others noticed. When Collins lifted the syringe, ready to step forward, Jack finally moved. He planted the cane and took one step through the press of bodies. His voice, roughened by years of dust and silence, cracked the air. "I know how to save your horse, sir." The words struck the morning like a rifle shot. Everything froze, the doctor's hand suspended, the crowd's murmurs cut off. Even Silver Dust shifted faintly in the straw ears, flicking as though the sound had pierced through his haze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, the silence cracked. First a snicker, then a chuckle, until laughter rolled through the stable yard in waves. The ranch hands threw back their heads, clutching sides. One mimicked a dramatic bow, another slapped his thigh, the noise swelling into something cruel. The cripple thinks he's a vet now. Save a racehorse. Hell, he can't even save himself. A few younger men went further, exaggerating a limp, dragging feet in mockery of the soldiers' uneven gait. Their howls bounced off the wooden walls, turning the scene of death into a carnival of ridicule. Jack did not flinch. He did not answer them. He stood tall, or as tall as his bent frame would allow Cain, rooted like a staff, eyes fixed not on the men, but on Whitmore himself. The laughter dimmed when another voice rose above the noise. Earl Thompson, the capataz, pushed his way forward. A man thick in the shoulder's jaw, lined with stubble, his presence carried the weight of intimidation. He jabbed a finger at Jack's chest. "Old soldier's gone mad," Earl sneered. "He'll kill the horse faster than the injury ever could." The crowd roared again, feeding off the cruelty. Earl leaned closer, the stench of sweat and tobacco heavy on his breath. "Go back to cleaning stalls, cripple," he spat, and gave Jack's shoulder a shove. The push barely rocked him, though it might have toppled another. Jack's cane bit deeper into the dirt, his boots steady. He did not retaliate, did not raise a hand, but his silence carried something colder than anger. His gaze was fixed hard as steel, unblinking. For a fleeting second, Earl faltered beneath it, though he quickly masked it with a bark of laughter. From the side, Charles Whitmore had been watching. Unlike his men, he did not laugh. Instead, he allowed a small curl of amusement to touch his lips, though it carried more venom than joy. He stepped forward, closing the space, until he stood a mere arm's length from Jack. "You," his voice dripped disdain, "save my horse. You couldn't save your own damn life." The words cut sharper than the shove, a direct strike at wounds invisible but known. For the first time, murmurs rippled instead of laughter. Men shifted, glancing between their employer and the crippled soldier, sensing a cruelty that bit deeper than humor. Charles, however, was not finished. His eyes locked on Jack's, testing for weakness, for retreat. Finding none, he allowed his voice to rise, carrying clear across the yard. "Fine. If you fail Callahan, you're out of my land by sundown." The declaration was sharp public binding. The men erupted again, clapping, jeering, hooting like they'd just witnessed the sentence of a fool. To them, it was entertainment, the morning suddenly brighter with the promise of a spectacle. They did not see the stakes as Jack did. To them, it was only the slow march of a cripple toward his own eviction. But Jack only nodded. His face showed no hesitation, no second thought. "Then I accept," he said quietly, but with a firmness that silenced even a few jeers. Surprise flickered across some faces. They had expected backtracking, an excuse, perhaps even a collapse. Not this steady resolve from the man they had mocked. Jack did not look at them, nor at Whitmore. His eyes found silver dust still trembling on the straw ribs, rising and falling. In that battered body, he saw not an animal, but a reflection of himself, broken, discarded, pronounced useless. And in that reflection, he saw every comrade he had sworn not to abandon. The old oath stirred in him again, steady as heartbeat. No one left behind. He moved forward, the crowd parting reluctantly as his cane tapped against the boards. Entering the stall, the smell of damp straw and sweat enveloped him, but he paid it no mind. Slowly, he lowered himself beside the stallion, the movement stiff, deliberate. His hands, scarred and calloused, reached out to rest gently against the horse's neck. The skin was hot, trembling beneath his palm. "We're not done yet, old friend Jack," whispered his voice, barely more than breath. For a moment, all noise outside seemed to fade, the laughter, the jeers, even Whitmore's derision. There was only the soldier and the horse, two cast-offs meeting, in the shadows of a forgotten stall, bound by something none of the others could see. The next morning broke hot and pitiless. The wind had not yet woken, and the dust lay over Whitmore's stables like a tired brown blanket. Jack reached the stall before most of the hands had finished their coffee. He stood at the doorway for a beat, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. Silver Dust lay where he had left him on his side, legs tucked awkwardly, breath whispering in and out like an old bellows. The stall smelled of damp straw and fear. Jack set what he carried on the rail, an ugly bottle of cheap whiskey, a stack of torn shirt cloth he'd cut into strips, a dented tin cup, and a bucket of water he'd begged off the side spigot. No surgical steel, no sterile gauze, no antiseptic pads. Just what a man could scrape together when the world refused him better. "All right," he murmured, more to steady himself than to comfort the horse. "We'll do this slow." He poured a slosh of whiskey into the cup. The vapor bit his nose, and in an instant, sand and smoke rose in memory. Desert heat, a blast crater, someone shouting for a medic who wasn't coming. The past tried to take him. He set his jaw and stayed here. He soaked a strip of cloth in the whiskey and eased down beside the stallion. Silver Dust's ears flicked back. His skin twitched, pulling away from the touch. Jack laid one scarred hand against the thick gray neck and kept it there, letting his palm warm the hair. "Easy, boy, easy," he said, voice low and even. "You're not alone." He worked the soaked cloth toward the ugly swell of the foreleg. The bone had long since been set in its wrongness by fate and negligence. That wasn't what he could change now. Infection was the enemy he could fight. He cleaned where the skin had split, where the flies loved to land, where dried blood crusted the hair into spikes. The stallion shuddered and tried to pull away. Jack leaned across him, forearm to neck, body curled to keep the horse from thrashing. "I know," he breathed. "Hurts like hell. Stay with me." He rinsed the cloth in the bucket, wrung it out, repeated the whiskey, pressed it again. The work settled into a rhythm, wet press, breathe, murmur, wait for the tremor to ease, move an inch, press again. When the worst of the grime came free, he took the dry strips and wrapped them around the limbs, snug but not choking. He tied the ends with a square knot he could undo with one hand. Improvised bandage, field tight, field neat. Every motion tugged at the thread that ran through him back to the sand. Sergeant Daniel Harris had been there, the compact man, with hands that never shook, even when everything else did. Harris had laughed at death the way men laugh at rain, like it was inevitable and not worth arguing with. He'd crouched in the crater with Jack once, cloth strips like these pressed to a private's thigh. "We don't need miracles," Harris had said, voice as calm as a grandfather's. "We need persistence. Keep the blood flowing, keep the wound clean, and hope." Jack heard the words like a litany now. Not a miracle. Persistence. Keep the blood flowing. Keep the wound clean. Hope. He massaged the muscle above the bandage with his knuckles' slow circles to coax life back into tissue that had learned to be afraid of its own function. When Silver Dust tried to kick, Jack moved his weight and hugged the leg with his ribs grunting as pain sparked across his hip where old metal still lived. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you." By the time the sun slid higher, sweat glued Jack's shirt to his back. Flies needled his neck. He eased away to rinse the cloths again, then went back, then again, until the water in the bucket went the color of weak tea. When at last he sat back on his heels, the stallion's breath had lengthened to shade. The panic had not left his eyes, but it no longer flooded them. "Good," Jack said. He poured a splash of whiskey onto his own palm, rubbed it over his knuckles, laughed once at the sheer stupid sting. "Welcome to medicine, soldier." He'd meant the joke for himself. The horse only blew a tired breath, warm and damp against Jack's sleeve. By evening, he could barely feel his own legs, but he dragged a wooden chair into the stall and set it beside Silver Dust's head. He kept one hand on the neck, his cane hooked over the rail like a sentry. Shadows grew long and then merged. The stable noises thinned to a soft chorus, the creak of a board, the occasional clink of a bucket, the polite cough of a horse clearing dust from its throat. "Stay with me," Jack said when the dark gathered. "We've seen worse." He wasn't sure whether he meant the horse or himself. The second day was the same, and the third. Clean rap massage whisper. Every morning he came, every evening he stayed. The days threaded together a line of beads on the cord of his resolve. On the fourth night, as he eased the fresh cloth beneath the bandage, a voice sounded in the doorway. "You plan on pouring all that rock gut on him, or you saving a drop for yourself?" Jack turned. Martha Jenkins stood there with a lantern and a skeptical eye. She had a small jar in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. "I don't drink," Jack said. "Good," Martha replied, stepping into the stall. "Then you won't miss what you've already wasted." She held out the jar. "Honey. Real stuff. And a pinch of sage. My grandmother swore by it." Jack wiped his hands on his trousers before taking the jar like he could clean the grime of the day off his skin that way. "You sure I'm sure of three things," Martha said, setting the lantern on the rail. "One, that man out there would spit nails if he knew I was here. 2, sage and honey beat your bargain whiskey any day. And 3, you're about the only one around here who looks at that horse and sees something besides a bill." She lowered her voice. "Don't let Whitmore know." Jack nodded once. Gratitude was too narrow a word for what rose in him. "Thank you." He warmed the honey with a little water from the kettle she'd brought, stirred in the sage until the thick gold ran smooth, then let it cool to a tacky glaze. When he spread it across the angry skin, silver dust flinched and then stilled. The sweetness masked the harsh bite of whiskey. Jack wrapped the cloth again. "That'll pull the heat," Martha said, or so Granny would say. "And if nothing else, it'll keep the flies off better than your swill." Jack smiled with half his mouth. "I'll take either." She looked at him for a long second, as if weighing whether to add something sharp or kind, then simply nodded and left the lantern. "I'll come by tomorrow night," she said. "Bring more if you've used it up." He watched her go, the small circle of light, drifting down the aisle, and felt the stall breathe easier. The nights lengthened and softened. When rain came, it seeped through the roof in fat, cold drops that plopped onto the straw like small insults. Jack shrugged off his coat and draped it over Silver Dust's back to make a poor man's tent. The coat would dry on him later. The horse would not. He dozed in the chair more than he slept, his hand always on the neck or shoulder, a steady anchor point. "Stay with me," he would murmur when the nightmares came, the horses and his own. "You're not done. Neither am I." He became to most of the ranch a fixture as invisible as the hitching posts. Invisible did not mean forgotten. Men noticed even what they pretended not to. They noticed the old soldier in the stall night after night and the stallion who did not die. They also noticed the easy target the situation offered. That cripple's wasting his time. One of the younger hands snorted on the 5th day, tossing a wisp of hay toward the stall as if to feed both animal and mockery. "Horse'll be dead before the week's out." "Put your money on it," Earl Thompson said loud enough for echoes. "I'll give you odds." Laughter darted off the boards like birds spooked from a fence. Someone kicked an empty feed sack so it skidded toward Jack's boots. He paused, looked at it, and went on cleaning. Earl, disappointed, tried again, later swaggering down the aisle to lean a shoulder into the doorpost. "You hear me, soldier," Earl said. "You want to play nurse, do it somewhere else. Men are working." Jack tightened the bandage on the foreleg and kept his voice level. "I am working." Earl bared his teeth. "That's something that doesn't pay." Jack said nothing. Silence was the only tool he had that never grew dull. He tied the last knot and stood slowly, a hand on the horse to push himself up. Earl waited for a flinch that didn't come. At length, bored by the lack of sport, he shoved off the rail and moved on, throwing a last line over his shoulder for the benefit of the audience behind him. Watch him fail, boys. Watch him fail. If the words landed on Jack, they didn't show. What showed, at least to a few eyes, was something else. One of the youngest hands, Freddie, with a nose still freckled from boyhood, lingered outside the stall. He didn't jeer. He just looked as if trying to see what the old man kept seeing. On the 7th morning, before the sun burned the dew to steam, Jack carried in a flake of fresh alfalfa greener than anything Silverdust had smelled in weeks. He laid it within reach, then knelt to change the bandage. As he worked, he felt the breath against his forearm change a hitch, a pause, a sniff. He froze. The stallion's head lifted an inch, then 2. The muscles in his neck trembled with the effort. But the eyes found the hay. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the lips stretched, fumbled closed around a stem. He chewed. Jack let out a laugh that sounded like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater and had just broken the surface. He sat back on his heels and rubbed the horse's withers. That's it, old boy. Keep fighting. He did not shout for the others. He did not need the crowd's ownership of the moment. He let it be small and wholly a horse eating hay, a man remembering that life can turn its head toward the possible. By that evening, word had spread anyway. You couldn't keep news bottled in a place like Whitmore. It leaked through walls and over fences, traveled in the space between two men's smirks. The next day, more eyes paused when they passed the stall. The laughter, if not gone, had softened, lost its bite. Some of the boys even stopped their mouths from forming jokes before they could get out. On the 10th day, Jack began something new. He tied a loop of soft rope around Silverdust's middle, padding it with an old blanket so it wouldn't chafe. He ran the tail of the rope over a beam and down to his hands. Up, he said, voice low, as he put his shoulder into the shoulder. Come on, you can do this. The first time the stallion's front legs pushed, his hindquarters wobbled and everything collapsed at once. The stall filled with straw and flailing, and the low, afraid grunt of a big animal. Jack took the fall on his ribs, gritted through the lightning it sent along his hip, and kept the horse from slamming his head against the boards. Okay, Jack said, breathless. That's one. We'll try again. He did not count the attempts aloud. He counted them with the deep muscles of his back, with the burn along his arms, with the rasp of his breath. He counted them in the way the stallion's panic shortened, each time replaced by something like memory. By noon, they could raise to a kneel and hold. By evening, they almost found it. The next morning, Freddie hovered at the door. Do you need a hand? Jack glanced up. Hold this rope, he said, and passed him the tail. Not too tight. When I say give, you give. They tried. Freddie, to his surprise, did not screw it up. When the horse faltered, he eased. When Jack pushed, he followed. After a while, the boy's face flushed with effort and awe. Again, Jack said. They both grinned when the shoulder locked for 3 long seconds before folding. He's doing it, Freddie whispered as if not to spook the moment. Yeah, Jack said, rubbing the neck. He is. 2 days later it happened. It was not elegant. Nothing in recovery is. Silverdust's legs scrambled. Jack's shoulder burned. Freddie nearly let the rope slip. But then the lines of the horse reorganized into a geometry that made sense again. 4 legs beneath a body, the spine stacked above the head. Lifted not in panic, but in orientation, ears pricked forward, The stallion stood. A shovel clanged to the ground outside the stall. Someone cursed softly. The space around the doorway filled with faces, their expressions stripped of mockery. For a long breath, no one said anything. Horse and man existed in a fragile equilibrium, and the world held still to keep from knocking it down. Easy, Jack said, because that word had become the ground under his feet. His eyes stung. He reached up and steadied the neck with fingertips, as if touching a prayer. Silver dust quivered like a newborn. He wobbled, bowed through the knees, caught himself, found a square. Sweat slicked every inch of him. His nostrils widened, drawing in the scent of hay, wood dust, old whiskey honey. From the back of the crowd came a thin whistle. Someone shushed him without looking away. Jack smiled and did the smallest of things, nothing. He did not ask more. He let the horse own the miracle. After a minute that felt like the length of a life, silver dust sank back to the straw, not with a crash, but with a choice. The stable exhaled. That afternoon, Frank Miller showed up. He didn't knock or clear his throat. He stood with a hand high on the door jamb and watched Jack wash the cloths, wash the wound, wash his own hands, as if the ritual cleansed more than skin. "What are you doing to him?" Frank asked finally. Jack wrung out the cloth and draped it over the rail. "Nothing special," he said. "Just not giving up." Frank's jaw worked. He looked at the stallion, then at the horse lines of Jack's hands, then at the stallion again. "Earl says you're wasting hay," he said, but there wasn't much conviction in it. "Earl says a lot of things," Jack replied. Frank almost smiled. "Almost, yeah," he said. He pushed off the jam, took a step, then another. "You need a better rope, let me know." It wasn't a pledge exactly, but it wasn't nothing. The next morning, Frank told two boys to take their jokes somewhere else. "Men are working," he snapped. They took the hint. News travels upward as well as outward. When word reached Charles Whitmore that the broken horse had stood, the owner made a show of indifference for nearly a day before walking down to the stall himself. He arrived clean as always, the line of his vest as sharp as a blade boot's bright. He kept his hands behind his back as if to avoid the contamination of care. So he said after he'd watched for 10 seconds that stretched like a minute, "It can stand." He let that sit, then added with a thin smile, "Big deal. It'll never run again." His voice was flat, but his eyes betrayed a flicker, something like annoyance, something like concern. Not for the horse, for order. For the fact that men now paused when they passed this door instead of spitting on the threshold. Jack didn't answer. He was busy massaging the shoulder, counting softly, 1, 2, 3, release. He didn't look up when Charles left. He didn't have to. He'd felt that kind of gaze before in other uniforms. From that day on, the stall had an audience that pretended not to be one. Men walking by slowed without meaning to. A boy found a reason to refill a bucket on this end of the aisle. Martha stood in the door longer than any recipe needed, wiping her hands on her apron, as if cleaning a second time would hide the softness in her eyes. Jack began to add steps. 3 days after the first stand, he used the rope to take the weight of the first lean forward. "Just a half," he told Silverdust. "Just one hoof." The stallion tried and failed and tried again. "Good," Jack said when he missed. Good when he found it. He let the wind stack like pennies in his pocket, a small weight adding up to something you could buy a day with. He talked less to the men and more to the horse. "We go slow," he'd say. "We stack the pieces." The tone mattered more than the words. Calm voice, steady hands, relentless patience, and the soldier's method, the sergeant's gospel. One evening, after the last light fell off the rafters, Frank leaned on the rail and watched the pair move together, Jack's limp and the horse's tremor out of rhythm, but somehow in sync. "Never seen that before," he said, quiet, as if to himself. "What's that?" Freddie asked beside him. "A man who looks like a crutch and turns out to be a spine," Frank said. Freddie didn't quite understand, but he nodded anyway. It sounded right. 2 weeks from the start, the stallion stood again. This time he stayed up longer. Jack slid his palm down the neck. "All right," he said. "Half step." He put his shoulder to the shoulder once more. The horse shifted, quivered, and the right forehoof slid an inch through the straw. Then another. Then paused. Outside the stall, no one moved. Even the dust seemed to hang mid-air, respecting the fragile choreography. Silver Dust gathered himself and made the smallest sound, half sigh, half grunt. He drew his weight under him and placed his left forehoof beside the right. 4 points. Square. He was not walking. Not yet. But the geometry of possibility had returned, and that was close enough to bring water to a soldier's eyes. Jack blinked it away. He wasn't ashamed of the wet, only of the way it blurred the scene he wanted to memorize exactly. He pressed his palm to the horse's neck, feeling the heat, the thread of pulse. "You're proving them wrong, boy," he whispered. "One step at a time." When Silver Dust lowered himself back down, Jack stayed kneeling in the straw a long minute. He didn't think about Whitmore's threats, or the doctor's needles, or Earl's laughter echoing from the rafters. He thought about Sergeant Harris pressing a cloth into a wound and saying persistence like a prayer. He thought about the men he had carried and the ones he hadn't, and how maybe redemption sometimes wore a halter and breathed hay scent into your skin. Outside, the ranch had not changed. Fences still sagged orders, still flew the sun, still cooked the life out of anything that stood in it too long. But inside this 12 by 12 box, something had shifted. A stallion who had been called a carcass had lifted his head to eat. He had stood. He had moved his hoof. A veteran who had been called useless had found a use no one else could manage. 2 silhouettes shared the stall, a man with a limp and a horse with a tremor, both upright, both stubborn, both alive, in a way that made the air feel new. Jack sat back in his chair, elbows on knees, and listened to the stallion breathe. It wasn't pretty, not yet, but it was steady. He let his own breath match it the way he had matched men's breathing in desert holes so they wouldn't drown in their panic. "Stay with me," he said for the 100th time. And for the first time, it sounded less like a plea and more like a promise. The Red River County Fair woke to brass band sunlight and the smell of fry oil. Tents bloomed along the pasture fence, pie contests, hog judging pens, a dunk tank where teenagers heckled anyone with a coin. The Ferris wheel creaking into its first slow circle. Folks drifted toward the livestock ring as if pulled by tide boots, shuffling dust into the air until the morning shone the color of wheat. Charles Whitmore arrived like a parade marshal who didn't need the parade. 2 of his hands led a gelding and a show mare for the auction, their coats brushed to a glossy sheen. Behind them, pulled reluctantly into the light, came Silver Dust. Weeks of Jack's care had turned the line between life and death in the stallion's favor. But in the open, he looked like a ghost wearing a horse's shape. Hips a shade too sharp, neck roped with effort, the left fore sounding each step with a careful, uneven note. The animal had learned to stand again. Walking came back in fragments. Today it came under 100 eyes. Whitmore's jaw never unclenched. He hadn't brought the stallion to raise money, he'd brought him to make a point. He wanted the town to see what happened when a ranch tolerated illusions. He wanted everyone, and one old soldier most of all, to absorb the lesson. They led Silver Dust through the paddock gate, toward the oval of packed earth the fair people called the pista. The crowd took him in with a single collective breath and then scattered it into laughter and commentary. "See what happens when you waste time on useless beasts," Charles said, not to the nearest man, but to all of them, letting the words ride the dust. The line caught. Heads turned, fingers pointed. Someone whistled low. "That's no horse, that's dog food," a man in a seed cap declared. "Should have put it down weeks ago," another answered, as if calling a bid. A pair of boys in Fair Day's shirts skipped along the rail, crunching popcorn and pitching husks toward the gray horse. The bits of white salt and hull hit Silverdust's shoulder and neck. He flinched, eyes blowing wide. The laughter grew in the way laughter does when it believes itself righteous. From the far side of the ring, Jack Callahan watched. He had not come to the fair for fun. He had come because an ache in his bones had roused him at first light, a sharp certainty that Charles's patience would find a stage. He stood behind the tilt-a-whirl for a while, staring through the gaps in its slats, then limped toward the crowd, with his cane biting a cadence into the ground. His face took in the morning and gave nothing back. But his hand tightened around the stick until his knuckles went the color of bone. Silverdust's head pitched, his lead rope jerked, and the memory that lived hottest in Jack, the one that burned whenever a body recoiled from a blow, flared like a fuse. He cut through the ring of bodies with unexpected force for a man with a limp. Elbows found space in him and moved aside. He stepped into the pista and planted himself between Charles and the horse. The murmur around the ring thinned into a long inhale. "This horse is not for sale," Jack said, his voice rough and carrying. "He can still live." The fair seemed to blink. The band at the far tent tried to find a key, failed, and fell quiet. For 3 beats, there was only the rasp of the wind through pennants. Then the laughter returned louder for having been held back. "Here comes the cripple's fairy tale," someone sang from the bleachers. "He's lost his damn mind," another chimed in, delighted to find the chorus. Jack didn't move. He stared at Whitmore and just as steadily at the men behind him. Someone had to stand between the horse and contempt. He had been that man before for flesh and blood soldiers. He could be it for a stallion now. "You dare contradict me in front of my people?" Charles said, stepping forward. His color rose into his cheeks, like something boiling over. "I dare because he deserves better," Jack answered. No heat, no tremor, just fact. Perhaps it was the calm that pushed Charles the rest of the way. He stepped in and struck Jack across the face, a flat crack that turned heads all the way at the dunk tank. The shock rippled outward. The laughter faltered, then, for the first time, some of it died. Jack's head snapped aside. His cane planted itself in the dirt without asking permission. The breath he pulled in tasted like iron. He lifted his eyes to Charles, and for a moment they were the eyes of a non-commissioned officer who had just been told to abandon someone. Charles pointed at Silverdust, as if the stallion were a line item on a ledger. "Then prove it, soldier." He didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. The ring carried it for him. "Here are your terms," Charles went on, each word crisp as a shot. "If that animal makes one full lap of this pista on his own legs without collapsing, you win. He's yours to care for. You do it your way. If he can't, you're off my land by sundown." The crowd boiled into it the way a crowd does when it's given both stakes and spectacle. "A cripple training a cripple," someone shouted. "This I gotta see," another called. Earl Thompson shouldered to the rail like a carnival barker. "Put money on it," he yelled. 20 says the nag drops dead halfway. Coins clinked, bills flicked between hands. Numbers rose and fell in the air like swallows. The sheriff drifted closer without committing to either involvement or retreat. Frank Miller stood alone near the far gate, one hand on the post, his mouth a hard line. Martha Jenkins pressed both palms together at her apron and didn't realize they had formed a prayer. Jack stood with the slap fading from his cheek and weighed nothing. There were no calculations left in him. There was only that old oath that had rebuilt itself in the last months around a horse instead of a squad. "Fine," he said. "One lap, one chance." He turned to the stallion, not caring who saw the tenderness in him. He reached for the halter and set his hand against the bone and hied. "It's you and me now," he whispered into the soft, hot space by the ear. "Just like before. We don't quit." Someone tossed a pebble that skittered to a stop near his boot. Someone else hissed to hush it. The fair was tilting toward a new kind of attention. The ringmaster in a bolo tie and a suit that didn't fit the dust asked almost politely, "You ready, folks?" as if what was about to happen were an act he'd booked. The gate swung. They led Silver Dust to the starting notch, chalked into the dirt. The sun had climbed to its merciless angle. The pista shimmered as if the air itself were baking. A cheer went up not for the horse or the man, but for the exquisite promise of witnessing a fall. "That nag won't last 10 steps, a voice crowed. "It's cruelty to even try another through-in, as if kindness were the same as distance." Jack slid his hand down the lead and took his place at the stallion's left shoulder. The rope had no pull in it. If he tried to drag, the horse would fold. He kept his weight where the horse could feel it, without fear where a companion would be felt. Across the rails, Frank shook his head, once eyes never leaving the pair. Martha's lips moved around words from some old grandmother's kitchen, the kind that seasoned food and pain alike. Earl Thompson drifted along the outside of the ring, slow as a shark's shadow. In his hand, hidden by the crowd's hips and elbows, the coil of a short leather whip hung like a second intention. Jack touched the stallion's neck. The horse quivered. He felt the tremble move into his own hand and used it to measure his voice. "Walk," he said. Silver Dust shifted weight, lifted his left for an inch, set it down again in the same place. The first step wants permission more than strength. Jack gave both. He breathed out slow. "Easy, boy. Breathe. Stay with me." On the third try, the hoof left a clean mark and landed a hoof length forward. The right four followed. The hind legs read the front and arranged themselves as best they could. The first 2 steps became 4. The crowd laughed as if the old predictions might still catch up and save them from wonder. Earl moved with the stallion, keeping to the blind side, farther from Jack. When Silver Dust's rhythm stumbled, Earl snapped the whip low and hard into the gray flank. The sound was a dry gunshot. The horse exploded head-up whites of the eye's haunches, scattering in search of an exit. Jack took the blast of motion in his ribs and rode it like a man trying to stay inside a toppled truck. The lead cut his palm, burned a bright line. The stallion spun to flee from pain and slammed toward the rail. Jack moved without thinking. He threw his body between leather and skin and brought his cane up like a baton. The strip of black that aimed for the horse caught wood instead, with a crack that made the ribboned booth ladies gasp. "No one hurts him again," Rack roared, a sound dragged from a throat that had learned to command in worse places. Silence dropped, stunned and complete. Even the Ferris wheel seemed to pause at the top of its cycle. The sheriff shifted his weight nearer Earl. Earl snarled and drew back for another try, but Whitmore cut the air with a small slicing motion. No. Not now. Either he trusted the bet to break the man naturally, or he knew the crowd's tide could turn fast when a bully draws blood in daylight. Silver Dust's breath blew fast and hot. He rocked on his forelegs, sweat popping along the shoulder like rain beating on a tin roof. Jack lowered his cane. He turned his back to Earl and put his forehead to the place where the horse's jaw met his cheek. "Easy," he said again, a thread pulled through a needle. "Breathe with me." He matched the stallion's heave with his own lungs at first, then slowed, coaxing the air toward a pace the body could carry. His hand slid to the pole, fingers resting in the groove there, the way Harris's had once rested on a helmeted skull. "We're still here," Jack murmured. "We're okay. Find me." The stallion's ears quivered, brought back from the far places where pain sends them, and tilted toward the sound. The heaving softened. One blink at a time, the wildness in the eye drained, until it left a tension behind. The crowd, which had come to feed off speed and collision, held still as if movement would break glass. Jack let the stillness stand for a count of 5. Then he stepped to the shoulder again, the lead slack but present. "Walk." The word reached a body that had been trained to listen before it had been trained to flee. Silver Dust lifted his left fore and set it down. The right followed then the hind. The pista took his weight and gave enough back to make the next step possible. They moved along the straight Jack's limp, unconsciously falling into a rhythm that answered the horse's uneven stride. The jibe made earlier a cripple training, a cripple dissolved in the fact of 2 flawed bodies choosing forward. Dust rose and clung to the sweat on both their faces. "He's moving." A boy whispered, surprised he'd said it out loud. "It's impossible," a woman said, and yet she leaned over the rail to see it anyway. The laughter had not turned to cheers yet. It had turned into something tighter, the thin, high wire that hums in the air right before it breaks into applause or breaks in two. At the 300-foot mark, Jack felt the stallion's forelegs begin to tremble harder, a quiver that starts deep and leaches outward. He brought his palm to the neck and put a little of himself there, a counterweight, a promise. He didn't ask for more than the next step. He said the word the way a man says grace. "Walk." Half a lap drifted behind them. Frank's hand tightened on the fence post. Martha's prayer shaped itself into names she hadn't spoken since she was a girl. The sheriff settled an elbow on the top rail and let his breath go. They reached the far curve. The outside foot had farther to travel. The body wanted to fall the short way. Silver Dust bobbled. His left fore slid and caught. His hindquarters sagged, then fought back under the load. A groan escaped him, animal true and decent in a world that liked its suffering polite. Jack kept his cadence and bled the tremor with a hand on warm hide. "Almost," he told him. "Almost." The home straight stretched ahead longer than it had any right to look. The crowd had lost its appetite for jokes. It had found a hunger for the end of something both of them had started. A man who'd thrown his money on Earl's odds folded the bill inside his fist and didn't remember to crush it until later. At the last curve, the stallion's knees dipped. His head fell. The old fear clawed through the new skill. Jack stepped closer, leading with his shoulder, and put the whole hinge of his body under the weight of the horse's will. "One more," he said like a man on a ridge whispering to a friend who can't see the trail. "Just one more." Silver Dust reached. The hoof struck, slid an inch, bit pushed. The balance rose out of the dirt and climbed up through bone until the line stacked true again. The crowd made a sound, then not an oh or an ah, but something that happens when a people remember how to breathe. They crossed the chalk mark the ringmaster had dabbed earlier with his boot. For a fraction of time, the fair found a silence so clean it could have been a blessing. Then the noise broke, like summer thunder. Hands, hats, voices. A chant grew clumsy and powerful. "Dust, dust, dust," Martha cried, and wiped her face with her apron, as if she could tidy joy. Frank didn't move, just closed his eyes for a second, as if he didn't trust them to keep what they saw. Jack didn't raise his arms or bow. He didn't think to. He turned to the horse and put his cheek to the warm, dirty skin between halter and eye. Silver dust breathed against him, big and real. The world could do what it liked on the other side of that. Across the track, Charles Whitmore held himself together with a kind of violent stillness. His hand had gone white around the head of his walking stick. He looked like a man swallowing a stone. 100 eyes turned to him. They weren't just the eyes of hands hoping for a boss's nod. They were the eyes of a town that had witnessed terms set and wondered whether the man who set them would keep his shape inside them. Whitmore felt the weight of it and made himself exhale. The words he formed cost him more than he could admit. "The horse is yours to care for," he said, each syllable like metal on the tongue. The cheer that followed didn't need music. It sprang straight from relief and respect, and the sweet satisfaction of watching arrogance tripped by the very rules it wrote for others. Whitmore turned before the sound reached him and walked away, shoulders hard, his shadow long and sharper than a hat brim. Earl muttered something vile and didn't finish it when the sheriff's shadow slid over his boots. Frank let go of the fence at last and allowed a smile to crease one corner of his mouth. The ringmaster dabbed at his brow with a polka-dot handkerchief and declared it a fine show because he had no words for miracle. Jack stayed with the horse. He stroked the neck and felt the pulse settle under skin. He didn't care who watched his mouth soften. He had not done this for them. "We did it, boy," he said, voice low enough for only one set of ears. "They'll never laugh again." Of course they would someday at something. People don't stop being people because they've watched a lap, but the laughter would not sound the same, not to those who had stood at the rail and felt their own throats tighten. That old reflex to sneer had a new memory to trip over. Jack led Silverdust out of the ring. The stallion's legs remembered to shake after the victory. It's what bodies do when the danger is past and the accounting begins. Jack let him rest in the shade of a cottonwood and loosened the halter so the horse could lower his head without strain. Martha came with a bucket and didn't say anything at all. She just held it at the right height. Frank took the lead rope for a minute so Jack could sit on the low rail and let the fire in his hip die down. The sheriff tipped his hat and found somewhere else to be. Beyond the tree, the fair rediscovered its appetite for pie and cotton candy and barking games. Band music stumbled, picked itself up, and rolled jaunty toward the midway. The dunk tank made a splash that startled a toddler into first tears and then laughter. Time, which had held its breath, exhaled and resumed. The story, though, didn't follow it back into noise. It lingered where the shadows cooled the dirt, and a man rested his hand on a horse's neck, the heat of both fading at the same human pace. A few people walked by and paused and didn't know what to say to either of them, so they said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only compliment that doesn't cheapen the thing it honors. Whitmore's men drifted unsure whether to pretend they hadn't bet the wrong way. Earl spat into the dust and left early. The town would remember that too, as towns always do. Jack rose when the horse was ready and turned toward the trailer that would take them home. He didn't look back to see if anyone followed with their eyes. He didn't need proof of witness. He had the only proof he'd come for weight on 4 legs, one full circle of breath that belonged to 2 beings, and one long promise. At the edge of the fairgrounds, where the noise thinned into open sky, he paused. Silverdust lifted his head and let the wind work through his mane. The old fear didn't vanish. Neither did the old pain. But they stood in a new light now, ordinary daylight, big enough to hold both endurance and the memory of applause. "Home," Jack said. The stallion leaned an ounce of himself toward the word. That was all. It was enough. The fair left behind, a wake like a river that had burst through a dry arroyo cheering gossip wagers settled or unpaid 100 stories told over pie and beer. But when Whitmore's truck rattled back up the Caliche Road and the county judge Bunting became a memory, the ranch settled again into its old sounds, the clink of buckets, the rattle of chains, the low thunder of hooves moving somewhere out of sight. Jack and Silver Dust came home not to a trumpet, but to a stall that smelled of hay and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Jack did not sleep late the next morning or the next. Victory at the fair had changed everything and nothing. A lap around a dusty pista won a promise and a kind of respect. It did not knit muscle overnight. It did not make scar tissue supple. It did, however, light a small lamp inside the old soldier's chest. And he used that light at dawn, the way a craftsman uses a lamp at his bench, steady, close, patient. He was always first down the aisle. Before most men had pulled on their boots, he had already warmed his hands in a bucket of water gone just shy of hot, had already unrolled clean strips of cloth, and set them in a neat stack on the rail, had already shaken out the blanket they used for the belly sling. He spoke little. He did not narrate his work. He pressed his fingers into tight muscle until the fibers yielded drawing slow circles up the tendons to keep blood moving. He checked the skin beneath yesterday's bandage with 2 eyes that missed nothing and a nose that could read infection as quickly as a dog reads fear. If a patch looked angry, he reached for the honey and sage Martha kept slipping him with a look that said she would fight lions for this foolish old man and his gray horse, if it came to that. He made Silver Dust walk in loops and figure eights around the yard, a rope loose enough to be a suggestion instead of a command. Half a circle, he would say. Now a hole. When the stallion tired, they stopped. When panic looked ready to rise, they waited for it to pass and resumed only when breath and eyes agreed. Sometimes Jack laid poles on the ground and asked for a step over, then another to remind the legs there was shape to moving, not just fear. On hot afternoons, he stood the horse fetlock deep in a trough to cool swelling. On breezy evenings when the flies gave them a mercy hour, he let the horse graze at the fence line until the mind, as much as the body, remembered what calm tasted like. The change came by degrees so small, you could miss them if you wanted to. A week after the fair, the stallion's walk steadied. The soft wobble in the knee hardened into a firm line. 2 weeks later, he stopped tripping at the 3rd pole. The first time he lifted into a slow, cautious jog, a tentative water cure that lasted only 4 strides, Jack felt laughter rise in him, like a boy who suddenly remembers a punchline. He swallowed it. He only said good and smoothed his palm along the neck, so the horse would feel approval without fireworks. That small flight broke something open. The next morning, with the sun tilted just so, and the wind slipping down out of the north, Silver Dust tried again, this time on his own. A light 2-beat trot across the sand of the round pen main, lifting in thin, silvery threads. A pair of hands by the fence clapped before whoever belonged to them could stop themselves. Another set joined. The sound startled the stallion, and he dropped to a walk, but when he looked back at Jack and found the man's eyes steady and proud, not greedy, he blew a breath and squared himself and walked on. You see that one of the younger ranch hands whispered, as if naming it too loudly would send it away. He trotted. What he did, another replied, hushed in spite of himself, was remember how to be a horse. Jack smiled, small and private. Pride sat uneasily on him, the way a modern hat sits on a man who spent most of his life under a helmet. He had no interest in glory. What moved through him when he watched the gray lift into that first trot was something less shiny and more durable, relief, gratitude, and the feeling of a promise being kept on both sides. Days grew into a rhythm that other men began to listen for. Freddie, the freckled kid who'd found his way to a rope at the right moment, started asking questions without his usual apology. How long on the massage, he'd ask. Until the knot softens, Jack would answer, taking Freddie's thumbs and showing him how to feel the difference between resistance and pain. How do you know when to stop? When he tells you. He doesn't talk. Sure he does. Jack tapped the horse's skin where a quiver had flickered. Right there. At first, the older hands kept their distance, some out of embarrassment for their earlier jokes, some out of a reluctance to learn anything from a man they decided not to see. Earl stayed away altogether. A losing bet and a sheriff's shadow had made him look elsewhere for a show. But work at a ranch is part imitation, and the young are quicker to imitate what brings results. The more time Jack spent in the round pen, the more other men drifted to the rail and watched. The more they watched, the more someone tried a quieter hand on a skittish mare and found that it worked. The more it worked, the less the yelling seemed like a requirement and more like a bad habit. Frank Miller did not change by proclamation. He changed by showing up. He leaned on the top board of the round pen and watched Jack in the gray move the limp and the irregular stride, finding a way to keep time together. He asked a question here, a question there, and filed away what he heard. He didn't try to hurry the horse, and he did not let anyone else try either. One morning, he walked the main aisle with a paper in his hand and tacked it to a post where everyone had to pass. No cruelty. We follow the soldier's way. He didn't add his name beneath it. He didn't need to. The men read it and read it again, and some smiled and a few scowled, and one or two tried to make a joke and found no one wanted the punchline. By the end of the month, you could hear the difference before you could see it. The stables sounded less like a factory, less slam and bark, and more like a barn that remembered animals don't speak English and so need something else to go by. Orders came softer and closer. Men stepped into stalls with their shoulders open instead of square. A boy who had thought himself brave with a whip discovered he could be braver without one. There is a speed at which news travels, and it doubles when the story has both humiliation and redemption. The county paper ran a black and white photo taken from the fair's fence line. Jack with his hand on a gray neck, the crowd a smudge of hats, and put the headline above the crease, "From battlefield to barn." A veteran's way of healing horses. A week later, a truck from a ranch 3 counties over rattled into the yard, and a man in a hat too new for his mouth asked if the old soldier could take a look at a filly that wouldn't load. Jack did. He didn't touch the rope for a long time. He stood at the bottom of the trailer ramp and waited for the filly to bring her head down and take a breath. And when she did, he stepped back and gave her room to take 1 foot forward without being pushed. It took them an hour, and when she stood inside at last, looked like nothing in the world but patience and a good day. The truck rattled away, and 2 days after that, another came. By the time the second paper, this one from the city, sent a reporter in clean boots and questions too big for a round pen, the phrase had fastened itself to Jack, the way nicknames do when they fit the soldier's method. Jack didn't like the way it looked when someone printed it in italics. He liked even less how his name looked in bold. He answered questions as briefly as he could. "What's your method, Mr. Callahan? Pay attention, don't rush, don't hurt him. Where'd you learn it? War. War, you learn to slow your breathing so the man next to you slows his. Horses aren't men, but breathing's breathing." The reporter tried to make poetry out of it. Jack let him try. The line that made the rounds wasn't the poetry. It was the photograph at the bottom, silver dust now fuller through the shoulder, trotting with his neck stretched forward and his ears soft, while beside him Jack's cane angled like a metronome, and his mouth for once had forgotten how to be a straight line. Inside the big house, Charles Whitmore pretended to be annoyed by all of it. Let them have their stories, he told a visitor. They'll tire of it. You can't build a business on a cripple's luck. He flipped pages in the paper as if swatting flies. His thumb, though, lingered a second longer on the photograph than he meant it to. One evening, near the end of summer, when the heat broke early and some of the clouds blushed instead of burning, Whitmore walked down to the small arena where Jack often finished the day. He stood by the fence with his hands behind his back, as if he had come to inspect a post and found a horse attached to it. He watched the gray pick up a slow jog and then drop back to walk on a voice cue alone. He watched the old soldier ask for nothing harder than the thing the horse could give in that moment, and ask it so cleanly that the horse did not think to refuse. "You proved me wrong, Callahan," Charles said at last. His voice was a scrape across gravel, half resentment, half something that had lived so long in pride it had forgotten the exact grammar of respect. Jack rubbed the stallion's withers and looked at Charles over his shoulder. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was him. He just needed someone to believe." Whitmore's mouth worked around words that didn't find shape. Perhaps an apology had never formed itself in his throat before. He settled for a nod so slight it could have been a twitch, then turned and walked back up the path to his porch, where an award still hung crooked on the wall, its glass filmed with a dust no maid had dared wipe since the stallion's fall. The light swung toward autumn. The days lost a little of their edge and gained in color what they surrendered in heat. The range grass went the kind of gold that makes even a windmill look like sculpture. In the mornings, when the first frost made the board squeak underfoot, Jack wrapped a blanket around Silver Dust's hindquarters after work and stood with him in the wide pasture behind the barn to cool down. He said very little. Being alive alongside another living thing does not always require translation. He noticed the way the stallion had begun to sleep on his chest again, rather than guarding his feet, a small trust that meant the body felt safe enough to fold. He noticed that the nicknames had shifted in the barn. No one called the gray the nag anymore, even when talking to men who hadn't been at the fair. He noticed how Freddie took a green colt and did not ask a single thing of it for the first 5 minutes, but its breath. He noticed, too, that when a new hand started in with his mouth and his swagger, the others did not laugh. They showed him the sign on the post, and if he didn't like reading, they read it to him aloud. One Saturday, the church ladies asked Jack if he would speak to the youth about perseverance. He almost said no. The idea of turning his life into bullet points made him itch under his shirt. But Martha caught him by the elbow on his way past the kitchen and said, "They need to see the shape of it, Jack, even if you don't call it that." So he came and told them about breathing through fear, and about paying attention to small things that wobble, and about carrying what you can when you can, and about putting down what you can't without shame. He did not talk about medals. He did not say the word war. He said the words friend and horse and together. A boy who had started the afternoon giggling in the back row looked at his shoes and nodded at the floor. If the world wanted a tidy lesson, it was welcome to write it around him. Jack's own lesson was always the same: do the next right thing for as long as it takes. By the time the first blue norther made the mesquite shiver, Silver Dust had muscle again where he'd only had bone. He would probably never run a race the way the chemical memory of his body might still crave in dreams. But he could move without fear. He could work lightly. He could carry himself and a sadness and a man's rough palm, and the sound of polite applause that had never mattered as much as a soft word. On a day when the wind was playful rather than mean, Jack asked for a longer stretch of trot along the fence. And the gray gave it with his head low and his tail level, as if writing a letter in the air to something that would understand. The men by the barn kept doing their jobs, but more often than not, they watched without meaning to. They watched. What they saw looked like mercy. What it was work. One evening, when the sky came down in sheets of copper and crimson, and the light found every burr on every stem of grass and turned it to fire, Jack took Silver Dust out past the last gate to the open pasture beyond. The world widened there. Fences became ideas. Beyond the far line, a small herd of Whitmore's broodmares grazed with their tails swishing in lazy arcs. From the hill you could see a slice of the river, mean and threadbare after summer, cutting a dark ribbon through the field. Jack leaned on his cane and watched the mares lift their heads and look over, then look back down to chew again. Silver Dust stood beside him, ribs expanding and falling in a slow tide. The scar along his leg caught the light and turned it into a white seam where the world had been stapled shut and had somehow held. Jack's own scars did their quiet shining under his shirt. For a long while, neither of them moved. Wind combed the gray mane and tugged the brim of Jack's hat, then left them alone. The heat that had made their lives small for months had passed through, and what it left behind was space. "They thought we were finished," Jack said, not loudly. His voice carried anyway. It threaded the space between them and the river and the sky, and did not sound like defiance so much as fact. He laid his hand on the stallion's neck and felt the answering life beneath his palm, stronger than it had been when he first touched it in the dark stall, calmer than it had been in the heat of the Pista Beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with garlands or headlines. "But we're still here." The words didn't need an answer. The horse shifted his weight a fraction toward the touch. Out in the field, one of the mares broke into a slow run, the kind that's really a joke. Told to the wind, and two others flicked their ears and followed. Silver Dust watched them go and did not surge after. He let his neck lengthen and his ears tip forward and his breath flow steady. Jack's cane bit into the ground, and he found that he could stand as long as the light would let him. Behind them, back at the barns, a new hand elected to leave a whip in the tack room, because the day had taught him something about how little it took to ask. Frank Miller walked the aisle and saw a boy massaging a wither with the kind of care he might one day bring to a baby's back. Martha put a pie on a windowsill and told herself she was cooling it for later, though she knew exactly whose hands would be dirtier than anyone's and whose slice would be a touch bigger than the rest. In the main house, Charles Whitmore paused by the frame of a photograph and just once lifted a hand to wipe a thin line of dust from the stallion's eye. The sun ran out of words and slid behind the horizon. The color did its slow surrender, purple into blue, into the sober gray of evening. The air cooled. Jack turned for the gate, and the stallion turned with him, matching his uneven stride, two silhouettes side by side, lengthening across the grass. Somewhere, a coyote made a sound that was more question than hunger. Somewhere else, a calf bawled and was answered at once. At the gate, Jack stopped and looked back, not because he doubted the pasture would still be there in the morning, but because he had learned to say thank you to the things that kept him alive. He said it without a word, the way he had learned to do most things of value. Silver Dust flicked an ear. The gesture said the same. They went in. The yard lights clicked on a pale geometry against the dark. The round pen cast a gray ring on the dirt, like a coin left on a table. Jack hung the halter on its nail and leaned his cane against the rail and listened to the barn settle into sleep. He lay that night on his narrow bed in the little room that had once felt like a sentence and now felt like a watchman's post. He heard the breathing of horses through the thin wall and matched it with his own. He thought of a sergeant in a crater teaching him how to bring another man's lungs back from panic by offering them his pace. He thought of how breath had saved them here too. Breath and patience and the refusal to leave a body behind. Morning would come, and with it, the work, the bandage, and the massage, the poles and the water, the boy. with another question shining in his face. The manager with another rule to enforce kindly, the owner with another pride to swallow or not. The soldier's method would continue to be a headline in some places and a habit in others. But in the pasture beneath sky big enough to hold a whole town's change of heart, an old soldier and a gray horse had made a small country that existed whether anyone named it or not. They had not won a championship. They had not cleared their ledger with destiny. They had, however, kept faith with each other. Sometimes, that is the only crown a life needs. Jack closed his eyes. Out beyond the barns, the river made its dry, stubborn curve through the land. Out beyond that, the fairground stood empty until next year, when someone would remember the day a crowd learned the shape of silence. In the stall nearest the door, Silver Dust shifted in his sleep and let out a breath that sounded like release. The night held. And when the morning came, it found them both in their places, still here, still at it, still making a way where someone had written an ending.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.